off last time, finishing this unit that deals with different visions of Israel. We saw, and so you'll want to take out your little booklets because we're going to finish up the text from that unit. We saw on page 16 several texts that illustrate the notion of the Israel of Messianic Universalist Utopianism. We saw on page 17 this text from Rabbi Soloveitchik, which relates to the Israel of Messianic particularism. It's a Jewish Messianic vision. It's really more about Messianism for the Jews than it is for the world at large. The third vision of Israel is illustrated on this reading on page 18 from the late Israeli philosopher Yeshayahu Leibowitz. And this is about the Israel of sovereignty and survival. In other words, it's really an internal picture. And what does he say? He says, you know, he was asked by a non-Jew about the nature of Zionism, what it meant to him. He says, my own answer to that non-Jew was that Zionism is the expression of our being fed up with being ruled by Goyim. Well, who said that? Yeshayahu Leibowitz, right? He says, I am aware that this we does not extend to all Jews. No, it's not every Jew shares that version of, Messianism. But still, it is the motive shared by Zionist Jews who differ widely in their human values and in their conception of Judaism. Zionism is best defined as the program for the attainment of political and national independence. Now that this has been attained in the form of a sovereign state, Zionism consists in the effort to maintain this independence. This is the function that Zionism performs for the Jewish people, in addition to inspiring the fear of authority, as does every system of government to maintain peace and tranquility. More than that should not be expected from any state. The values people wish to realize, whether general humanistic ones like the idea of a modern model society, or specifically Jewish, such as the prophetic vision, the messianic promises, or most authentically a condition in which the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Those are not the affairs of the state. Their realization is a proper object for the aspirations and the striving of individuals and groups within the state. It is outside the sphere of action of the executive and administrative apparatus of state coercion, which can never be the suitable instrument for the implementation of these values. So what's his program of Zionism? How would you describe that?
Maintain the state.
Just to maintain the state, right? We're fed up with having the Goyim rule over us, so we rule over us. We have our own place, right? And what's the focus of this? Survive. Maintain the state for, all the reasons that we need it, right? And that's enough. And as far as messianic aspirations, well, those are, you can do those one way or another within the state, but that's not the function of the state itself, right? Questions, comments? Yeah, Daniel.
In about the middle of the paragraph, there's a line, says, more than that should not be expected from any state.
Yeah.
He's describing a very cold, bureaucratic, administrative management kind of thing without setting up, an image of higher values. And virtually every state that I can think of does do that. I mean, the United States is about individualism and freedom and all these highfalutin ideas. It's not just keeping lights on, which is the way he describes the state.
Well, you can argue about that with the United States. I mean, yes, we have certain ideals, but not everyone agrees on how you achieve those goals within the United States or any other country. So he says, well, we can duke it out as far as how we get to those ideals. It's not the role of the state to impose those ideals, right?
But to uphold democracy.
Okay, so fine, and people have different divisions of what democracy means. Welcome to Texas. Okay? Yeah.
Can't get
I-
political.
I can get very political. However, it only to illustrate that there are, in fact, different visions about how you accomplish certain things, right? Okay, so that's the view of the Israel of sovereignty and survival. And then on page 19, you see this text about the Israel of aspiration, right? So Rabbi David Hartman gives this, his broader vision, and this is just one piece of a lot of stuff that Hartman wrote about this goal. I live with the guarded hope that out of this complex and vibrant new Jewish reality will emerge new spiritual directions for the way Judaism will be lived in the modern world. Israel expands the possible range of halachic involvement in human affairs beyond the circumscribed borders. All right, that was a little snippy, okay?
Right on the edge, Rabbi.
I know, that's where I live. Of home and synagogue to the public domain. Jews in Israel are given the opportunity to bring economic, social, and political issues into the center of their religious consciousness. The moral equality of the army, social and economic disparities and deprivations, exercise of power moderated by moral sensitivity, all these are realms that may engage halachic responsibility. We want to understand what I mean by what he means by halachic, right? From the standpoint of Jewish law. That Jewish law informs how we do all these things, right? Leibovitz, who himself was a very traditional Jew in most respects, would have argued that halakha doesn't necessarily tell you how to do all of these things. Right? Hartman says, absolutely, and they should. Right? From this perspective, the fact that Israel enables us to make the whole of life the carrier of the covenant is in itself sufficient to ascribe profound religious significance to the secular revolt that led to Israel's rebirth. I celebrate Israel's Independence Day with the recitation of the Hallel Psalms, as by the way we do in our minyan, thus expressing gratitude to God for having been given the opportunity to renew the full scope of the covenantal spirit of Judaism. My religious celebration is not a judgment on God's activity, but only on the opportunity that Israel makes possible. The opportunity may be missed, but that does not in any way detract from the religious possibilities created by the event. The recitation of Psalms of Thanksgiving on Independence Day does not entail any divine guarantee regarding the successful realization of those opportunities. Right? So what is Hartman saying here?
Because Israel exists, we have the opportunity to live a broader Jewish life than, at least in Israel, than it has been possible for the last 2,000 years.
Correct. And therefore, there are all sorts of things that, Jewish law moves us towards, and that, we can expand the realm of Jewish law to apply to all these things and therefore make a much richer Jewish life. That's part of the aspiration of Israel, right? And, are these things possible in the exile? Well, yeah, I mean, maybe to a limited degree, but not entirely, right? You can't, if you live in the United States, you can't talk about, the morality of a Jewish army, right? I mean, you talk about it from a third person standpoint, right? But you can't really impact it, right? So how do power and responsibility create new religious opportunities for the Jewish people? Sovereignty gives you authority, okay? And therefore, you can apply all kinds of Jewish values and goals to situations that you didn't have control over before. Okay? Questions or comments up to here? Okay, so now we go to the next unit, and this unit is going to cover different understandings of what we mean by peace. Okay? We spent a lot of time, those of us who spend time in the synagogue, we spent a lot of time praying for peace, right? What the heck is the peace that we're praying for? Yes.
Okay, I wrote a book about peace, and I wanted to get a definitive definition. So I went, those who are old enough, a dictionary. And I looked it up, and what they said was peace is the absence of war or conflict. That was the dictionary's definition of peace.
Mhm. Okay, so that is one definition of peace.
That's
Right.
broad.
But again, when we talk about peace as Jews, we may be talking about different things, right? Which is why that definition, for certain purposes might be useful, but when we're talking about the state of Israel and the peace that we desire between Israel and its neighbors, it's not very helpful.
Then maybe it should be called peace.
Well, maybe, but we still talk about it as peace.
But don't we talk about it as shalom? Is that the same as peace?
For our purposes today, we're going to assume that shalom and peace are the same thing, but still require some more refined definition. Meaning that when I talk about peace and when you talk about peace, we may be talking about different visions. Yeah, Jerry.
Don't you have the external peace, which was her definition, but then you have the internal peace for you personally, right?
Okay, so
Right?
right now, I'm not going to go into the notion of internal personal peace. Okay? Now, maybe when you say your prayers, that's what you mean by that, and that certainly fits under the definition of shalom. For our purposes, in a class that is dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're going to leave that aside for the most part. Yes, Ann?
When people are bombing us all the time, it means they're at war with us. That's, being attacked is not being at peace.
Okay, new. Tell me something I didn't know.
Well, it almost sounded as if you were gonna say that there's some definition of peace where you could say that Israel's at
I'm
peace
gonna
now.
show you 4 different definitions of what we mean by peace. Okay, I even wrote the shorthand on the board for you. Okay? And you'll see that these are really different understandings of the peace that we are praying for, okay? Each one has a different agenda. Each one impacts our values and our policies in different ways. So first, utopian peace, okay? And this is the one that you primarily see in certain Jewish sources, in particular within the prophets, right? You know, in our world, right, we have this gap between the aspiration and the reality, right? You know, we know that we're a long way from the Messianic era, but we still pray for that. We still shoot for that, right? So this is a utopian kind of peace. The peace that the prophet Isaiah talks about, where the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, when everybody is going to live side by side in peace. No one will threaten anybody else. Everything's going to be groovy, right?
On Noah's Ark, they had all those animals. Was there peace?
Oh,
on
God,
Ark?
I doubt it. Yeah.
So how's that work then?
Yeah. That's definitely not this, okay? And also, just remember that Noah's Ark is part of a broader picture of a world destroyed. So it's definitely not messianic, right? But there are messianic visions, visions that inspire us to hope and to set standards by which we set ourselves and our world. And utopian visions are grand. Okay? Sometimes they're so grand that we give up on them because we can't really achieve them. And so it kind of leads you to a certain passivity, right? And it's not something that I can bring about. It's not something that everybody in this room could bring about. You know what the word utopia means? It means nowhere. That's right. Yeah,
Really?
it's really. Yeah, what were you gonna say, Ryan?
When I was reading through this, what came to my mind was, if you could describe a utopian peace, it would have been the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and
Look how that happened, how it ended.
yeah, how did that turn out? Well,
Yeah, but that would have been utopian peace.
yeah, and remember, I think in the other class I mentioned last week that the Messiah by definition is the one who does not come, right? Well, so in this kind of peace also, this is the peace that does not come. It may be a vision, for some people may be clearer than others, and certainly for the prophets it was clear, but it doesn't necessarily come. Until something radical changes, then there's not much we can do to bring about utopian peace. Okay? Beautiful vision, but not necessarily reality. Okay, that's piece number one. Piece number two is imperial peace, meaning it's a time when there's no war, no hostilities, peace and quiet. And the reason why it's peace and quiet is because you won.
Oh.
Right? The peace which comes with victory. Right? Peace is attained when I win and you lose. Right? We'll see later on an example of this from the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 20. But you should know that there is a group of, I would say, significant thinkers on the Middle East who their vision for the Middle East is what they call the Israel Victory Project. Okay? And what that means is that they believe that the only way for this to end is the way that World War II ended. How did World War II ended? Surrender, right? And when the Palestinians surrender and admit that they lost, then there will be peace. Now, you can argue with that, okay? I'm not, totally sold on this. I'm just saying that that ties into this view of imperial peace. Peace is achieved when you win.
Ain't gonna happen.
Well, maybe not, right? There are arguments on both sides about that. I'm not here to solve that argument. You're right.
The problem with that is, even if.
No, there's only one problem.
Okay, the problem is that if a country were to surrender, they're surrendering as a country. It doesn't mean that the people are necessarily in agreement with what the government is doing.
That's possible, but the reality is that when a government does that, there might still be people who are willing to go to the mat and continue the war. It's just like, if the Palestinian Authority and Hamas surrendered and basically said, Israel, you win. It doesn't mean that it would be an end to terrorism.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but would be a big step, right? Would be, at least in this view, a real accomplishment to get to that point. It would lessen the threat to Israel's existence considerably.
But it wouldn't bring peace.
Well, it would bring this kind of peace.
If it did bring peace, it would be oppressive to the other people who surrendered.
Well, maybe. I mean, one can argue that that kind of peace would be better for them in the long run than continuing a war that they won't win, can't be allowed to win, to drive, the Jews into the sea, right? And this is an argument that's being made in many corners of the Arab world today, right? That, okay, Palestinians, it's time to give up the illusion that you can drive the Jews out and to get what you can get, to get an independent state, to get some limits on, shall we say, Israeli territorial encroachment, right? On the, lands where Palestinians live. Okay. And maybe that would be the best thing for them in the end. I'm not here to sell that. I mean, there are plenty of people out there selling that. Okay? I'm just, saying that's one view of what peace means. You don't have to agree with it. You just have to, recognize for what it is. Yeah, Jerry.
After the Nazis surrendered, there was some kind of a war that went on for maybe 5 years and fighting with the people who didn't agree, right?
What?
Didn't the Russians and the Americans have to fight 5 or more years to keep going?
Well, I don't know about fighting. I mean, I don't know how much actual fighting there
Well, there
was.
was a lot of
I-
fighting.
Well, look, that wasn't about the Germans fighting. When the Germans surrendered, the Germans stopped fighting.
Yeah, the military.
And yes, I'm sure, a lot of Germans were a lot happier being under American control than they were about being under Russian control,
Right.
because they knew who was gonna let them live and who wasn't.
Yeah, the German officers were rushing to surrender to American officers before the Russians. could
Absolutely.
snag them. Yeah, there's
Absolutely.
It's an amazing picture.
Okay,
But is it, that sounds like that's part of the deal. You're gonna have a peace, but we're always gonna be fighting to keep this peace.
well, I don't know. I think you could say there will always be people who disagree with that notion of peace, who will not accept that notion of peace, but they can accept when they're beaten, and most of them will. You know, when the Japanese surrendered, right? It was a wrenching reorganization of the way they viewed the world. But they did.
Yeah, they had that's a remarkable example of a real change in a country.
Yeah,
It's
huge
incredible.
culture change.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
it's
after all, if
possible.
your emperor is seen as divine,
That's right,
you can't surrender to anybody.
right.
But they did.
It took 2 bombs.
Yes, maybe. I mean, or would have taken an invasion
Right.
of the Japanese islands, which might have been worse.
Right.
I'm not enough of a historian about that to say one way or the other, but I know the arguments. Right? So, okay, imperial peace comes with winners and losers, with some level of subjugation. Maybe the notion of imperial peace is also something that goes along well with the notion of chosenness, right? You have a relationship with a God, and God says, this is my chosen people. Not that other people don't have a relationship with me. God is the God of all nations, but have a special relationship with his nation. And so that makes it maybe a little bit easier to look at peace as the peace which I manage, which I declare because I won. Okay, third piece. Third piece. I really need to go a little farther, okay? We'll have more time for questions and comments later. Third piece is the piece of justice. Now, you have a hard time finding this in the tradition, but you can see it a little bit, and we'll look at it later on in what Moses says in the 2nd chapter of Deuteronomy. He says, essentially, I don't have any claim on your land. I have no claim to your space. It's yours, right? The peace that I'm offering is a peace of coexistence, right? I can't come into your land unless you give me permission. And if there's anything I take from you, I have to compensate you because it is yours, right? This is a piece of justice in the sense that everyone's rights are preserved and protected and maintained. Now, this idea of peace can have a lot of significance for contemporary life. It doesn't seem to be the peace that the God of Scripture is interested in. God seems to be more interested in imperial peace, right? If you go and destroy the Canaanites, then you'll have peace, right? For whatever that's worth, right? So Moses personifies the peace of justice, but the fact that God undermines it, and that seems to make it a little more difficult to accept this. Of course, we're not just a biblical religion. The Judaism of today is really rabbinic Judaism built on top of the structure of the Bible, right? And of course, you have a lot of rabbinic literature that addresses some of these themes, and so we're going to see a particular piece from the Midrash, which articulates this kind of position. That peace is a value we have to pursue, even if the situation doesn't lend itself to peace. Okay? So we'll look at that a little more later on. But the idea is that our obligation to pursue peace is, it's not just something that we pursue in, let's say, geopolitical terms. It's we pursue it because of our own values, right?
For sure.
Okay, so, And this peace also exists in the prophets, not as strongly as the Utopian peace model, right? So here's a piece from the prophet Zechariah, who says, "There shall yet be old men and women in the squares of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand, because of their great age, and the squares of the city shall be crowded with boys and girls playing in the squares." They didn't write songs about that passage in literature, right? You know, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit alone. Right? That's the song we all learned as kids, right? This is a little more complicated. This is not going to be, you know, a Jerusalem where lions and lambs live side by side, right? Or where swords are, you know, crushed into plowshares, right? We're not going to change the laws of nature. We're not going to change a whole lot, but there'll be a new normal when people are not afraid, and children will be able to play without being afraid, right? Now, that's realistic peace, right? That's the non-utopian peace, the kind of peace that I think a lot of people would hope for today, would settle for in the absence of the utopian peace. Maybe they have concerns about an imposed peace, an imperial peace, or the ability to create a peace of justice, but realistic peace, right? It's where, you know, we have sort of the peace that we can achieve. And then you ask yourself, well, is that enough? Is that a big enough goal? Right? Because, you know, again, is that the peace that we've prayed for thousands of years? Okay, Jerry.
So they say when the Messiah comes, he's gonna change things. So it sounded like to me, he's gonna follow what Isaiah put out, right?
That's, you know, well, that's, you know, the classical expression
Right.
of what the Messiah will do. You know, when the Messiah comes, I don't think he's just gonna, you know, create safe playgrounds.
He's not gonna let the lion and lamb go together. I don't think he's gonna go that far.
You know, the lion and the lamb, that's a lovely little metaphor, isn't it?
Rambam.
That's what Rambam said. Yes. Okay? Right. So, but, you know, we have to clarify what peace we want, what peace we think we can achieve, before we can get anywhere with a peace between Israel and its neighbors. Okay? Other comments or questions here?
Do you think that as we get peace with the other Arab countries, that those Arab countries might start putting pressure on the Palestinians?
I do, and that may be a different solution to the problem. I'm actually very hopeful on that front. I talked about it on Yom Kippur. The Arab world is a lot more concerned about Iran than it is about Israel. Iran is much more an existential threat to countries like the UAE, because Iran would like to have the UAE. They, you know, if you go back far enough, he did have it, right? Most Arab countries see Israel as a very stable country and as and they see Iran as a source of instability. Now, the Abraham Accords may well be a big step towards the Palestinians kind of giving up the game. Now, again, gotta remember, a lot of Palestinians already gave up the game. That's why you have Palestinians living outside the Middle East. You know, one way or another, they got to, let's say, Canada or America, and
They found a different
and they
way.
found a different way, and they're just, you know, it's like, enough with all that.
Right.
They saw that what the Palestinian leadership was doing was totally unproductive. And he said, you know, I'm gonna have another life in another place. And a lot of them have said that, right? I don't think that the game will be up unless and until Saudi Arabia goes in that direction and recognizes the state of Israel. Now, Saudi Arabia has long had informal contacts with Israel, the kind that they don't have to admit in public to Islamic extremists, right?
Right, and the Wahhabis, it seems like they're starting to lose just a little bit of their grip. I mean, obviously I don't live there and I'm no Islamic expert, but from what I see, it's a little less influence here and there.
Yes,
As the king passed and things changed,
Yes.
it's slowly turning.
yes. So we'll see. We don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, nobody's crystal ball had the Abraham Accords in it.
Yeah, it's shocking.
Yeah. And frankly, until, you know, Sadat went to Jerusalem, nobody had that in their crystal ball either.
Right.
Yeah, God
Right?
bless
But
them.
those things can happen. Those things can and do happen when Arab leadership wises up and says, okay, what are our real problems? You know, our real problems are not Israel, right? And so the Palestinians, you know, they could have a state.
Sure.
And, you know, when they are prepared to give up the goal of destroying Israel, then there will be grounds for a Palestinian state. But I don't think they will give that up, or at least enough of the leadership will give it up until Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel. That's the big cheese. When we get that, you know, we'll have a different dynamic.
Don't you think?
And that will change the game somewhat. It may render a lot of the stuff we're talking about moot. Right? Yes, Ann?
What are the chances that any Muslim state will accept Palestinian immigrants so that they can live under Islam?
Very limited,
None.
very limited.
And why not?
Why not? Because they don't want them.
Right.
Well, I know they don't want them, but why don't they want them?
Why don't they want
They
them?
don't want
They
to
went
support
into
us.
Well, they don't want
They
Jews either,
destroyed
for that
them.
matter, you know, I mean,
And they want the financial burden.
they don't
So
want the
they
burdens.
went to
They don't want
Lebanon.
a group of people who they see as fomenting instability.
Mhm.
The countries that have gone into the Abraham Accords, they're all interested in stability. So maybe
Well,
that,
Don't you think if they educated as, you know, we're in a different century now, and if they could educate and
So
get
the
those people
leadership-
out of the camps,
so the leadership is
Yeah,
educated.
terrible.
right?
But remember that the leadership is also afraid of the Arab street. Right?
Yeah.
They have to, I mean, you know, that's why the Abraham Accords is such a big step, because it's, you know, the idea of normalizing relations with Israel is a huge step towards stability. And it undermines all these forces that promote instability.
Oh, I know.
Somebody else had yeah, please.
I think there is an issue with some of the ultra-Orthodox Jews who, you know, make it more difficult for the Palestinians to accept Israel, in particular when they take land,
Yes, ma'am.
from
Throwing
the Arab,
stones at them.
you know.
Yes.
That's a fun thing.
I mean,
Yes.
so I think that compacts and makes it more difficult.
Yes, and that is why one of the conditions for all these countries coming in on the Abraham Accords was that Israel set aside indefinitely plans for annexation of territory, right? That is also a signal to those in the, let's say, the greater Israel camp. That's sort of a catch-all term for many of those Jews, whether Orthodox or not,
Mhm.
who say, well, you know, it's stupid to give up even an inch of our land. In other words, it's all our land. And we need it, and we want it, and we're keeping it. And we will gradually drive out the Palestinians. Well, that's not very productive
No.
from my standpoint. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, and it's also, I've noticed it in life, that there's a lot of people that like to make a lot of noise and cause trouble, but they don't stand in the back when they have to clean everything up afterwards. They're not the one in the uniform getting shot at because of something that maybe they are, I'm not saying they're not in danger, but it's astonishing, people like to cause a big problem, but they don't want to work on the solution after.
Right, and just to give you the most extreme example of this, are those who would like to bomb or tear down the Dome of the Rock, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that, why? Because Dome of the Rock was built on top of the Temple Mount, right?
Right.
If you're ever gonna have the temple rebuilt, God knows why you wanna have it rebuilt. I would offer our parking lot, for a stockyards for all the animals that we're gonna sacrifice. Bring them into Barg Sanctuary if you want.
I've suggested that many times.
I'm sorry?
I've suggested that many times.
Yeah,
That would be a world war.
yeah, well, talk to the
Exactly.
president, I'm sure he'll give you a hearing.
He won't, he's got way bigger things to deal with. I love
I'm
the
just
law,
saying
he's not gonna.
that,
I know.
the people who are trying to get rid of the Dome of the Rock.
That's-
And that's why Israel has such intense security there. It's not just because of the Muslims, it's because of the Jews,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The extremist Jews could cause Israel way more problems than the Muslims there are likely to. Yes, Jerry?
Okay, supposedly, Saudi Arabia is concerned about Iran. They made an agreement with Israel to let them use their airspace if they ever have to go attack Iran, where they would actually be able to fly over Saudi Arabia to go over there.
I'm sure that's been discussed.
No, I've heard it's been negotiated.
Well, it wouldn't shock me.
So to me, if something like that happened, that tells us somebody's concerned and willing to. deal
And
with
Saudi
it.
Arabia is very concerned.
It should
That
be.
is their number one concern.
Mhm.
And nobody could make things worse in Saudi Arabia than Iran. Yeah.
So if Saudi Arabia and the other more moderate Arab countries are so concerned about Iran, what is the holdup? What is stopping them from recognizing Israel and having a united front against Iran?
Well, again, there's that little problem with the Arab Street. I mean, you have probably noticed in the last 10 years that there is a hell of a lot of instability in most of the Arab countries, right? So in countries where the concern about that is very high, they're gonna be very slow to bring about a significant change like that, because they cannot predict the reaction from among their people. The fact that these countries have gone ahead with it makes it more likely that it will happen in the future. I mean, they're sort of paving the way for everybody else in the Arab world to come to terms with Israel. The last ones to do it will be the Palestinians, because they have the most to lose, also to gain, but
Sure.
but that's not how they see it today. But once Saudi Arabia changes positions, they are the big fish, and that is the big game changer.
Yeah, that will change everything.
And what is stopping them?
Well, again, they do not, they want to make sure that it will not destabilize the kingdom. Anything that might notice they have modernized a little bit. The role of women changes a little bit, but everything there is step by step by step by step, baby steps usually, right? Because instability is the biggest evil in the kingdom. Because, instability is like, there goes that monarchy.
Right.
And then who comes in place of them? Could be horrible,
Absolutely.
could be worse than, Hamas.
Yeah.
You'll wind up with, somebody like ISIS or Islamic State, whatever, right?
Sarah, do you think as things change economically, with the Arab countries, like they're getting the tourism from Israel, it's opening up the tourism. The Emirates is flying to Australia, and to go to Israel, it's taken 3 hours off the journey, and it's so much cheaper to use Emirates air. So people are flying, it's a one-stop, they fly
Yes.
from Perth or Sydney to Dubai, and Dubai to Israel.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. No, I've noted this is all part of a big process. Big change process in the Arab world. And yes, there are conveniences involved for everybody, right? In other words, if Arab countries don't have to pretend that Israel doesn't exist, right? That opens up all kinds of possibilities. And when they do it, they'll say, sheesh, why didn't we do this a long time ago?
You're right about
Well,
that.
there are reasons why they didn't do it.
Right.
Right? But again, as their leadership moderates, as their leadership gets more and more Western education, they will play for peace and recognition of Israel, because they will see that as serving their own interests.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the internet and, like you said, the next generation,
Yeah.
because of all the cross-cultural sharing it's caused, the kids, they won't want to go to war anymore, for the most part. They seem to be a little bit different. I noticed that in the military, there was a shift before I got out. The personality of the kids were different. They weren't as mean, I guess, is the way to put it. Maybe it'll help.
Yeah, it's like, you can be an American and still have a global view of the world.
Sure, why not? It's the same planet.
Yeah.
The Chinese need to relax a little bit.
Yeah, it would be nice. Yeah, Bob.
I guess anything's possible since the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland
Yeah, that was
have
remarkable
made
too,
peace.
man.
Anything's possible. Sure.
Okay, so let me get back into the texts in your binders. And if you look on page 24, we're gonna take a look at some of these things. We'll get through as much of this as we can in the next few minutes, okay? So, text number 1 is really just about our daily prayers. I don't think I need to read through these. I mean, you're familiar with most of this, all right? All of these things are part of daily services, right? And it doesn't include Oseh Shalom Bimramav, right? There's that too. May the one who makes peace up there, bring us a little something down here too, right? So, we are a people who pray for peace all the time, right? It's like the ultimate blessing. If you look at that threefold blessing at the beginning of this text, right? So what's the ultimate level of blessing? The ultimate level is shalom, right? So, the only question is, what does peace mean in these prayers? Well, I think it's clear that, it means different things to different people in different camps. Okay? But, any of these could see peace as a blessing. Right? You may not like one or more of those visions of peace, but you could still accept that it might be an improvement on not having peace.
Well, the Abraham Accords would fit into peace of justice.
Yeah, could be. Right? Everybody wants a just and fair peace where everybody can live and let live. Right? Some people will say, well, any peace in which Israel still exists is not a just peace. Right? So you have to get past those kinds of folks or get them to give up. Yeah, Ann.
There's a reason that they say that. And it's against some law for non-Muslims to rule in a place where they have already.
Yeah, so there is this ideal in Islam, which says that in any place where Islam has ruled, you may not allow it to be given back. Well, there you are. I mean, I think the Muslims have pretty much given up on Spain, right? So it shouldn't be that difficult. Maybe it was pretty difficult back in the day when it was happening. But it shouldn't be that difficult for them to give up on Israel if they gave up on Spain.
How many hundreds of years did it take before they gave up on Spain?
Well, not so long. Not so
The
long.
Dome of the Rock's not in Spain.
I'm sorry?
The Dome of the Rock is not in Spain.
That's also a problem, right? But I mean, you had lots and lots of mosques in Spain,
Oh, yeah.
and they're all lovely churches.
Yeah, just like they
There were
changed the church in
synagogues.
Turkey or wherever it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay, moving on.
Muslims are taking it.
So now, let's look on page 25, and you'll see the vision of utopian peace in Scripture. So, a couple of classical texts. Isaiah chapter 11. A shoot shall grow out of the stump of Jesse, a twig shall sprout from his stalk. All right, so you know what the stump of Jesse means, right? King David is the son of Jesse. So in other words, the messianic vision is that the Messiah will come from the house of David. This is just a flowery way of saying that, right? And the Spirit of the Lord shall alight upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and insight, etc., etc. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for the Lord, and judge the poor with equity, and decide with justice for the lowly, etc., etc. The wolf will dwell with the lamb. Okay? A babe shall play over a viper's hole, and an infant pass his hand over an adder's den. In all my sacred mount, nothing evil or vile shall be done, and I mean nothing. Right? For the land shall be filled with devotion to the Lord as water covers the sea. All right, that's pretty utopian. All right? So in the foundation story of the Jewish people, what's the purpose of the land?
Say again?
In the foundation story of the Jewish people, what's the purpose of the land?
Promote Hashem's law.
Yeah, that it's the place where that aspiration is going to be lived out. It's going to be the law. It's going to be the way things are. Well, I'm sorry. I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. Not the Messiah, not empowered. Okay? I apologize for not being the Messiah.
That's a heavy job, you may not.
I know, I mean, and the pay is so poor. You wouldn't believe it.
You what? What'd you say?
So the
The
pay is so poor.
Yeah, I imagine it is.
Yeah. Look at the next text from Isaiah chapter 2, right? So in the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm above the mountains, tower above the hills, and all the nations shall gaze on it in joy. And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, etc. For Torah shall come forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And thus he will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. Okay? So is this a little bit different from what you saw in Isaiah 11?
Well,
It doesn't have the lion and the lamb.
This is more of a practical approach.
Yeah, it's still utopian, but it's not miraculous,
Right.
right? And what's the role of human beings in this vision?
they have to stop.
Stop fighting one another.
Yeah, they have to stop fighting, they have to get along, they have to live this out. Live out this aspiration, right?
Sure.
Now, is this a vision of peace that we could bring about in our lifetime? Or is it something that we just have to pray for?
Oh, yes, can we try both? We can work on it,
We can work on it,
Exactly.
yeah?
still pray for it.
But I think the things that we work on are the steps
Right,
rather than just the end vision.
that's true.
Well, ideals are very rarely reached,
Yes,
and this is the ideal piece.
yes, yeah. So you keep the ideal in mind, but you work on baby steps. And look, is the United States a better country in 2021 than it was in 1821?
Sure.
Right? I think most of us would go along
Yeah,
with that.
generally speaking, yeah.
Yeah.
By a long shot.
Yeah. And you don't even have to argue about what the history was.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so that's utopian peace, and that's where it comes from in the Bible. You have, maybe the more exalted messianic version, or the version where, we help make it come about. And then there's imperial peace. Let's look at text number 4 from Deuteronomy 20. Right? We'll have to stop after this one, but we're just going to take a quick look at it. Right? When you approach a town to attack it, this is not like, you approach a town in Poland or someplace, right? Right? This is, within the promised land. You shall offer it terms of peace, and if it responds peaceably and lets you in, all the people present there shall serve you at forced labor.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Whoa.
If it does not surrender to you, but would join battle with you, you shall lay siege to it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, which is what's going to happen, right? You shall put all its males to the sword. You may, however, this is the Torah we're talking about, right? Right, you're troubled with the Torah?
Yeah.
Well, that never happens to me. You may, however, take as your booty the women, the children, the livestock, and everything in the town, all its spoil, and enjoy the use of the spoil of your enemy, which the Lord your God gives you. Thus you shall deal with all towns that lie very far from you, towns that do not belong to nations hereabout. In the towns of the latter peoples, however, which the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, it's like the Canaanites,
Oh, wow.
you shall not let a soul remain alive. No, you must proscribe them, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you, lest they lead you into doing all the abhorrent things that they have done for their gods, and you stand guilty before the Lord your God. Now, by the way, before you get too upset about this, being in the Torah, I want to tell you, it didn't actually happen that way. You know, there was no genocide of the Canaanites. Right? We know that from later scripture. We know that from archaeology, that Canaanites and the Israelites may not always have been best buddies, but they coexisted for, through much of the period of the Judges. Okay? So it didn't happen like this, like when Joshua went in and, the walls of Jericho came down and so on and so forth. They didn't just kill everybody. Thank you. Thank you for that round of applause. Right? But this is a view of the imperial vision of peace. Peace is achieved when you win.
When you defeat your enemy.
When you defeat. Now, it doesn't have to mean when you exterminate your enemy. Right? I don't know too many, there are some, but I don't know too many people in Israel today who are, supporting that kind of vision of an imperial peace. It's just, they keep throwing bombs at us from Gaza. Let's go in and take Gaza apart until they quit. Now, I can make a case for that. I may not, like the generals in Israel are not in favor of it, but I can make a case that that's, a perfectly rational approach, and one that a lot of Israelis are, they're so tired of this happening over and over again that they want to see it happen too.
Right.
Is that going to happen? Think about this for next time. How do you grapple with troubling texts like this? And, if you have young children, how would you explain these texts to them? Doesn't sound.
Do you have an
easy,
easier
does it?
question?
I know,
Rabbi,
I know.
who wrote this and when?
Who wrote this and when?
That's
Well,
the
that's all the time
question.
we have for today.
You know what? What about when the